Шановні слухачі, зараз у нас буде лекція Едварда Волтерса, генерального директора FastCase. Це один із провідних юридичних видавців у світі. Вони мають понад 900 тисяч передплатників. Також він викладає закон про автономні транспортні засоби у Корнелл-Тех, у університеті Джорджтаун та закон роботів у Корнелл-Тех. Так, якраз бачите цю інформацію також на екрані. І Едвард спеціалізується на корпоративній консультаційній роботі і має надзвичайно велику історію чудових компаній, у яких він працював, яку ви також можете побачити додатково у програмі курсу. Зокрема, працював у Білому домі в управліннях у справах зі ЗМІ. Тож, чекаємо на ваші питання. Це ваша остання лекція. Гарного вам заняття. Пишіть у чаті і також просимо вас за можливості підключати камери. Yes, so we are able to start.
Well, thank you, Anastasia, and thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you for inviting me to join you today. This is exciting because we are really at the very frontier of both law and technology. And that is, I understand, the whole charge of the school, right? So we are pushing in some ways the frontiers of what is possible. So today we're going to talk about criminal law and how criminal law deals with machines. And there's a particular area of this that is interesting to me in my academic research. What I am interested in is not opening the robot. I don't want to see how the code works. I don't need to see the motors or the LiDAR sensors for a self-driving car. I'm a technologist by practice, but my academic interest is really in the law. In my law of robots class and my law of autonomous vehicles class, what we really examine is the challenge to law that these new technologies pose. The idea behind these classes is that law students today will graduate into a world that changes much faster than it did when our parents went to school. The world will constantly be confronted with new technologies. Maybe robots, maybe self-driving cars, but who knows, right? It could be nanotechnology. It could be asteroid mining or interplanetary jurisdiction questions. It could be the law of vaccines. One thing is sure, we as a generation will be faced over and over again with very new facts. And a question for law students and policymakers in the future is, how do we deal with those facts? In my class, we talk about a very famous debate when the internet was young between a federal judge in the United States named Frank Easterbrook, who said, law does not have a problem with new technology, right? The whole idea of the law is that we apply law to new facts, whatever those facts may be. So when something new is invented, like the internet, we don't have to start from scratch and create new law for each thing that is new in the world, right? We simply apply existing law to new facts, and if people don't like the outcomes when we do that, then they can draft new laws. And I think for many people, that was very reassuring. The idea that law would not be challenged by new facts. You can simply apply the law as it has evolved over hundreds of years to whatever facts we encounter. That's reassuring. We don't have to create new law for colonizing Mars. We don't have to create new laws for jetpacks, right? As Judge Easterbrook said at the very first conference about the law of cyberspace, he said, there should be no law of cyberspace. At the University of Chicago, the school where he was a teacher as well, he said, we don't have a class about the law of the horse. Sure, you may have commercial transactions about the sales of horses. You may have sports betting contracts about horse racing. There may be all kinds of torts that are created by accidents caused by horses. But if you created a class that was just about the law of horses, you wouldn't understand anything more about criminal law or torts or the law of sports betting. In fact, if you taught those subjects in the context of a horse by itself, you would actually probably understand less about each of the individual subjects. Well, so the day after Judge Easterbrook spoke, a young law professor named Larry Lessig, now a law professor at Harvard Law School, said, yes, of course, that's right. However, the whole history of law, of common law, of civil law, of all law, is that the law is constantly changing. And one thing that drives that change is the emergence of new facts. Take cyberspace as an example. There are things in the world that are not present in cyberspace. When you try to apply the law from outside of cyberspace into cyberspace, sometimes the outcomes would undermine the law we're trying to preserve. A good example that Professor Lessig raises is the purchase of alcohol. In the real world, if you want to purchase alcohol and you are 12 years old, the person who is selling it can identify that you are not old enough to buy alcohol. You're a 12-year-old, and we can see that. However, on the internet, nobody knows you're a 12-year-old. This self-authenticating, this identifying characteristic of purchases of alcohol in the real world is missing in cyberspace. You don't have the face-to-face interaction. To put it differently, there is something new in cyberspace in anonymity, right? Or something missing in cyberspace, the ability to look at the person who is making the purchase and understand how old they are. And Professor Lessig says, look, this new feature of these new facts is exceptional, right? Not in every case, but in some cases. And when these new facts are significantly different, maybe because of an additional feature or a feature that is missing, then we do have to create new law. If we don't, the outcomes will undermine the very goals that the law is there to protect in the first place. I think Professor Lessig would say law is policy. We have law for reasons. There are goals in policy behind our law. And those goals are things that we should seek to protect. I think Professor Lessig would also say the history of law includes these kinds of changes. Change has always been a feature of the law. And the question that we wrestle with in my law of robots class and my law of autonomous vehicles class is what kinds of challenges do these new facts pose to the existing law? I don't want to see how LiDAR works. I mean, I'm interested in how LiDAR works, but that's not what I want to see in class. What I want to see is, do we hold LiDAR to the same standards that we hold a human driver? If LiDAR makes fewer mistakes overall, but every once in a while creates an accident that people wouldn't, how does law deal with that? And if we apply the law the way it exists today, would that reinforce the goals that underline the law? Or would it undermine those goals? And if it undermines it, how can we adjust the law in a way that protects the policy goals of law in the first place, right? So the overarching question is a world that will be filled with new facts, with fact patterns that no one has seen before, that we sitting here in 2020 can't even imagine. What is it going to be? Transhumanism, the law of immortality, the law of designer drugs. We can't even imagine what those issues will be sitting here today. But the intellectual exercise is to examine those new facts in the context of law and to see where the law bends, to see where the law breaks. In some cases, new facts actually cause us to see a problem that was in the law already, but that had not yet been exposed. And so this re-examination of our law in the presence of new facts maybe helps us to find problems that were in the law before that we just had not had the opportunity to examine yet. And under the examination of new facts, we can resolve those conflicts, right? Okay, that's a long setup. I apologize. I'm in a great kind of nerdy mood today. I don't know how well that translates, but I really want to get into it with you today, if that's okay. Okay, so if we're going to do this for robots, if we're going to test the law with robots, then we have to understand what the goals of law are, right? So today we're going to talk about criminal law and how criminal law should apply to machines, to robots, to thinking machines, right? And this doesn't have to be fanciful. You don't have to imagine like an anthropomorphic, like a human-looking robot. You don't have to imagine something from Ex Machina or maybe C-3PO from Star Wars. Think of a Roomba, the little vacuum cleaning robots that your cat rides on. Think about a self-driving car. Think about something as simple as anti-lock brakes that pump the brakes in your car, right? How do we think about criminal law as applied to machines? That's the challenge. And then we should say, in a world that is full of robots, and we are surrounded by robots, voice assistants in our house, voice assistants in our telephones, machines that help us operate cars, machines that vacuum the house, machines that do any nature of things, that trade stocks. In a world full of those robots, how should criminal law apply to them? Should it apply at all? Is there a way of deterring bad behaviors like we do for people, but deterring those same bad behaviors for machines, right? So I start from first principles. Why do we have criminal law in the first place? What goals are we serving by having criminal law? And I think for many law professors, I suppose, they would say the goals of criminal law are things like corrective justice. We are trying to right a wrong that has happened. Criminal law is supposed to deter bad behavior. It is supposed to keep people from doing things that we consider to be illegal. Criminal punishment is supposed to rehabilitate people, right? If people serve time in prison or pay a fine, they are supposed to see the error in their ways so that when they are released, they don't do the same thing again. We rehabilitate the offender. There are many who say that criminal law serves a function of retribution. It is something like a societal expression of the distaste for a certain action. Society says, we think this is wrong, which ties to the last point, societal statement of values. And then finally, restitution. We are trying to make the victims of crime as whole as we can. We're trying to return them as best we can to the state they were in before the crime was committed. These are hard. So let me just say at the outset, these are some values served by criminal law. Probably not all of the values. There are some maybe second order values like the swift administration of justice We want to maintain appropriate prison populations. There are plenty of times where prosecutors will not bring charges against someone who they know has violated the criminal law, but it's small, and maybe it doesn't matter. I think about something like jaywalking or speeding, right? If you're speeding in your car, you're pulled over, the police officer says, I am going to let you go with a warning today, but I'm not going to give you a ticket. Watch your speed. So there are a number of different goals of criminal law that we're trying to serve here. And there's no book that we can pull off the shelf that says, you know, what are the goals of tort law? What goals, what policy are we trying to accomplish with securities law or something else? But I think criminal law theorists, at least, would say these are the main policy goals that we're hoping to accomplish with criminal law, right? So, you know, what happens when machines make decisions that have criminal law implications? If a human driver kills someone with a car, there are a number of criminal charges that human driver could face. In the US, things like vehicular homicide, and you could be prosecuted by the state and sentenced to jail time or a fine for committing that crime. Now, what happens if the human driver is not touching the wheel? If the car is operated by Uber or Waymo, and again, not science fiction, right? This is happening all over the place today, all over Europe, all over the United States. Autonomous cars are already on the road. If an autonomous car does the exact same thing, how does criminal law deal with that, right? What does criminal law have to say about that? So I would say that, you know, you see this in the Halevi article, if you read it. Criminal law has very good frames for dealing with people. And there's defenses like incapacitation or self-defense. There are all kinds of ways that you can deal with human violations of criminal law. There are pretty good frames for objects in criminal law. If a thief uses a screwdriver to break into your house, the manufacturer of the screwdriver isn't liable for that use of the screwdriver, right? The screwdriver itself has no liability for being used to break into your house. So those things are well understood. How should people be held accountable in criminal law? How should tools be held accountable in criminal law? And now the question, what about this middle part? What about machines that are somewhere in between an inanimate tool and a person, right? We haven't really been faced with this a lot in the past. How should criminal law deal with these actors that are in between a person and a machine, right? So Professor Halevi has a really good frame for this. Professor Halevi says, you know, we should start by thinking about the elements of criminal law. And at least in US law schools, this is taught with the two Latin phrases, actus reus and mens rea. These are the elements of a crime, right? If you look at a crime in the US, the definition of a crime will include the actus reus. What is the act? You know, to drive faster than the speed limit, to cross against a light. And these are the acts of criminal law, right? And then there is the mens rea, right? Or the mental state required for the crime. And mental state looks something like knowingly, negligently, you know, with malice aforethought. There are all of these mental states for the crime. And Professor Halevi in his article says, look, you know, when we're talking about criminal law, the only thing that you need to be convicted in a criminal case is actus reus and mens rea. Importantly, most statutes don't say who the actor is. It doesn't say a person may be convicted of murder when they knowingly take the life of another, right? Knowingly exists in the law, take the life of another exists, the mens rea, the actus reus. What doesn't exist in most statutes is the who. And the reason the who doesn't exist is that in our whole history of law, the who has always been the same. The who has always been a person. And that's always been understood. There's been no reason to specify the who because there hasn't been any who other than people. Now, for the first time, that has changed, right? You can have a who that is not a person, that is not a thing, that occupies the space between a thing and a person. And Professor Halevi, in his article, says that doesn't matter. If the statute says that something is illegal and a criminal offense, as long as you have the actus reus and the mens rea of the crime, then you have liability for the crime. You could bring a criminal case against whoever the who is. Now, I recognize this sounds a little bit far-fetched, right? Some of you may be thinking this is science fiction world, right? You are talking about a time far in the future with Blade Runner, right? You are defining a world that is full of magical robots, not today's world, right? How could a machine have a guilty mind, a mental state requisite for a crime? But I would point out two things here, okay? The first thing is that many of the mental states for crime are no mental state. If the crime is a strict liability offense, that means that there is no requisite mental state. Again, think about speeding. If you are driving faster than the speed limit, it doesn't matter what your mental state is. There is no mens rea for speeding. It is a strict liability offense. Whether you have a good reason or a bad reason, whether you know the speed limit or don't know the speed limit, if you are driving the car faster than the speed limit, you get the ticket, you pay the ticket. And if your autonomous car is driving faster than the speed limit, you have the actus reus, driving faster than the speed limit, and you have the mens rea, which is no mens rea. It's a strict liability offense. Now the question that we wrestle with is, how do we hold the car responsible? Do we hold the car responsible? There is a crime that has been committed. This car is driving faster than the speed limit. What best serves the goals of criminal law? And you could imagine a number of outcomes for that question, right? One outcome would be you do the same thing for an autonomous car that you do with a human piloted car, which is, I will just write a ticket and give it to the person sitting in the car, right? And we don't care whether the person was driving the car or reading a novel or checking email. That person is going to pay the ticket. And we are holding them responsible for the actions of the car. They should know if the car is exceeding the speed limit, they need to take control back. That might serve some of the goals of criminal law. You could imagine separately that the person is blameless in the situation. There might not even be a person in the car, right? The car is speeding and there's nothing the person could do. The owner of the car just receives the ticket by mail. What's she supposed to do? She couldn't slow the car down. She wasn't even in the car, right? So in that circumstance, we might want to hold the manufacturer responsible. That could be Daimler-Benz, that could be Waymo or Uber. It could be Toyota or someone else. Whoever manufactured the car and wrote the software that permitted it to be speeding is the one who could stop it from speeding. So we may want to consider making the manufacturer of that car liable. You could also imagine a world where we say nobody is liable, right? If the car is speeding and there's no one in it, we can't really deter nobody, right? You can't teach the car with a speeding ticket, and the person who owns it can't really change that behavior, just a mistake. Not much to do about it. We throw our hands in the air, right? It's like if today you went to go pull somebody over for a ticket and they had left, they were just gone by the time you pulled them over. You know, who do you give the ticket to? We don't really know. So this comes to Professor Halevi's theories of responsibility, right? In these circumstances where a machine commits a crime, who we hold responsible really depends on what our theory of liability is. And here, we're going to look to existing law. We're going to draw analogies between how we find people responsible in criminal law today and apply those to the world of machines, right? So Professor Halevi says, you know, there are three theories of responsibility that we might apply from the old pre-robots world to the robotic world, right? And the first theory is the perpetration by another theory, right? And this is for the simplest robots, right? This is for a very simple machine. The metaphor here is like a screwdriver, right? Do I have a screwdriver I can hold up? I don't, alas. So, okay, here it's a letter opener. It's a letter opener is my metaphor, okay? So I pick a lock with a letter opener, which is really shiny in this video. Okay, so it's not quite that shiny here, but I use a letter opener to pick open a lock, right? What responsibility does the maker of this letter opener have? None, of course. The maker of a letter opener could not foresee that I'm going to use this letter opener to commit a crime. When they make the letter opener, they imagine that I'm going to open my mail with it, right? Not commit some crime with it. I'm not going to use it to pick someone's lock open. It wouldn't make any sense to hold the manufacturer of this liable because they couldn't foresee that it would be used to commit a crime. And there's not really much they could do to keep people from committing crimes with letter openers, right? So with a perpetration by another liability, we say the actor is the person who uses the tool, the criminal who picks the lock with the tool. And that criminal absorbs all of the responsibility, all of the criminal liability for breaking and entering, right? And that makes sense. That advances the goals of criminal law. If we hold the lockpicker, the person who uses the tool, liable, if we can deter them with the threat of a criminal sentence, then there won't be any crimes committed, right? We serve all of the goals of criminal law by holding the person who uses the tool liable. It wouldn't serve any of the goals of criminal law if we held the manufacturer of the tool liable, right? So that makes sense. Perpetration by another liability. Or I would say that Professor Halevi says, it makes sense when the tool is a very low grade tool. So if you are using a machine to commit a crime, right? And the machine has very low level intelligence, then it doesn't make any sense to hold the the machine or the machine manufacturer liable. Imagine I use an autonomous car to drive to rob a bank, right? It doesn't make any sense to hold the car manufacturer liable for the bank robbery. And if we did, if we punished Waymo or Uber, would there be any fewer bank robberies? No, of course not. There's nothing they can do if we deter them to reduce the number of crimes committed. So when the machines are operating at a low level, when they're not being used to commit the crime in some way, it doesn't make sense to hold them responsible. And our law has good frames of dealing with this. It is perpetration by another liability. We treat the machine just like we would treat a tool. And again, in my metaphor before, this is sort of like the liability of things, right? You don't hold a dog responsible for criminal law violations. You don't hold a letter opener manufacturer responsible for violations of criminal law. Okay, as the machines get smarter, the theories might change a little bit, right? So imagine for a second a software machine that could pick a combination lock, right? You have an artificial intelligence that turns the knob and listens to the tumblers and uses sensors to be able to determine the code for a combination lock. All right, and this uses artificial intelligence and very precise sensors to understand what happens. Now, imagine under my hypothetical that a criminal uses this tool to break into a safe and to steal money. Okay. Well, now we're not quite in letter opener territory, right? This machine is highly specialized to do something that will commit a crime. And so Professor Halevi says, in a world like this, you might think about the machine as an accomplice, right? I think about the person who drives the getaway car to the bank robbery, right? When you drive the car to the bank robbery and everyone gets out of the car pulling on ski masks with weapons, you may not be the one robbing the bank, but you have a pretty good sense of what's going on. And criminal law holds that accomplice liable for the criminal actions of the co-conspirators. And as the machines get more and more sophisticated, you might imagine this kind of accomplice liability making sense. So the person who makes the machine that cracks the lock is not robbing the safe in my example, but it is a natural, probable consequence of making this lock-picking technology that people are going to use that technology to commit crimes. It is a natural, probable consequence. And it's interesting, this looks something like negligence. There's a whole area of criminal law that deals with criminal negligence. And think about something like vehicular homicide here, right? So like the idea is that there is a standard of reasonableness that you can break and commit a criminal law violation. And so I think here, if you invent a machine that would be very effective at committing crimes, you might additionally be liable as the manufacturer for crimes that are committed with that machine, right? And I don't think that's maybe even very controversial. Are we serving the policy goals of criminal law when we do this? Yes, yes, I think we are. You want to deter the person who uses the tool. So you want to hold the user of that tool liable at criminal law. You want to hold them criminally responsible. And for the person who makes the tool, the tool that has a natural probable consequence of a violation of criminal law, you want to hold them responsible too, right? And if you hold them responsible, they will make fewer machines that can be used to commit crimes, right? They are an accomplice in some sense. They know, or they should know, that the tool will be used to commit a crime, and therefore they should be held responsible for those crimes when they are committed. They are culpable in some way. They have a mental state. They knew or should have known that it was going to result in the commission of a crime, and the crime itself was in fact committed. Now, could you hold them responsible for bank robbery? You know, I don't know. Maybe as an accomplice, but again, we have an actus reus problem there. And so I would say this is a place where existing law may not fully pull in thinking machines, right? For me, the difference between perpetration by another liability and natural probable consequence liability is the sophistication of the tool and maybe how specialized it is. But more than anything, it is the foreseeability by the manufacturer of that tool that a crime might be committed, right? When you create a self-driving car, although it's theoretically possible someone could commit a crime, it is not reasonably likely or a natural probable consequence of creating an autonomous car that someone would use that autonomy to commit a crime, right? No, certainly no more than creating an existing car. So it really is the foreseeability that that machine or that autonomy can be used specifically to commit a crime. And then let's go to the highest order machines. And Professor Halevi here is thinking about very smart machines, probably machines so smart that they don't really exist yet. And what he says here is where the machine is exhibiting emergent intelligence, where it is committing crimes in a way that nobody could predict, no one could foresee, right? The owner of the machine says, walk to the corner and get me a copy of the New York Times, the newspaper, as quickly as you can and come back. And the machine strikes down and kills somebody on the way to buying the newspaper, buys the newspaper and comes back, right? Who should we hold responsible in those circumstances? There's been a murder in my example, and we have this thinking machine that murdered somebody. Should we hold liable the person who said, go buy me a copy of the New York Times, you know, or maybe the International Herald Tribune? Should we hold them liable? Would that satisfy the goals of criminal law? Well, probably not. The owner of the robot who says, please go buy me the newspaper, can't in some way foresee that the machine would murder somebody in order to get the newspaper more quickly, right? The machine is exhibiting kind of emergent, unpredictable behavior. That is what makes machines so useful, that unpredictability, that you don't have to code everything ahead of time, that they can do things that they haven't been programmed to do, is what makes robots useful. You could imagine the same thing in a less exotic version. If I say to my autonomous Tesla, drive to the supermarket where someone is going to put groceries in the car and then drive them back to me, but the car on the way back fails to stop for somebody in a crosswalk and kills them. If the criminal law puts criminal liability on the owner who's not in the car, who simply says, go pick up my groceries, will that deter bad behavior? No. There's no bad behavior on the part of the person who says, please go pick up my groceries. right? So this is not like the perpetration by another liability, where you hold the person who is using the tool liable. That would not accomplish the goal, the policy goals of criminal law. Here, if we want to deter the bad behavior, we need to find probably somebody else responsible. And here that could be either the manufacturer of the machine or possibly the machine itself. The manufacturer of the machine might be able to put code in that would avoid those kinds of actions. That could say, you know, like Isaac Asimov's 3 laws, like, you know, no machine shall by action or inaction cause harm to a human life. You could imagine that being built into the code and holding the manufacturer liable. Separately, you could imagine you might hold the machine itself liable. That is possible. Now, that might seem a little bit crazy to say that we could hold the machine liable, but I want to think about that for a second, right? So we have good criminal law liability for people. We have good understanding of how criminal law deals with tools. We're wrestling with what happens in the middle here. Holding a manufacturer liable could be one way to deal with it, although the individual machines will constantly be learning. They will have, after the time they're manufactured and delivered to the market, some added form of intelligence from reinforced learning or supervised learning or machine learning in a way that the manufacturer can't really predict. So Halevi says it might be possible to hold the machine itself liable at criminal law. Is that bonkers? Is that a ridiculous idea? Is the idea that we could hold the machine itself liable crazy? Well, let's talk about that for a second. So our law already does have a whole body of law that deals with artificial persons. And that's corporations, right? At least law in the US holds corporations liable for violations of criminal law. If a corporation violates criminal law, it can be criminally prosecuted, even though it's not a person. By the way, this reinforces Professor Halevi's point. There's no subject in most criminal laws. So if it's a corporation that has the actus reus and the mens rea, why can't we hold the corporation responsible? And in fact, criminal law does all the time. You see criminal prosecutions brought against companies all the time, whether it's criminal violations of antitrust law or negligent homicide or securities violations. Artificial persons can be held responsible for violations of criminal law. And the law considers corporations to be people. And they sometimes call it in corporations law artificial personhood, which maybe perfectly anticipates the idea of machines that exhibit some of the behavior of people, right?